nau mai, haere mai, tēnā tātou katoa. Welcome to the third and final webinar for TOAH NNEST Tauiwi Caucus. TOAH NNEST Tauiwi Caucus is live today on YouTube from Whanganui Atara, and today's presentation is LGBTQI+ inclusive practice. LGBTQI+ is an important part of ending sexual violence, as promoting a world free of homophobia, transphobia and biphobia is linked to violence prevention efforts, as rigid gender norms are a key risk factor at both an individual and societal level. It is my absolute pleasure to warmly invite our presenters today, who are Judy O'Brien and Angelo Lebeau, and I'll hand it over to them for today's session.
Kia ora, everybody. Kia ora tātou, I'm Judy O'Brien. I'm the Program Coordinator for the Sexual Abuse Prevention Network based in Wellington. We run primary prevention programs in schools, businesses and community groups, including the Mates and Dates program, and I'm a facilitator of that program as well. I'm also a board member for Outer Spaces, which is a Wellington-based umbrella organisation for 4 different community initiatives to support and empower gender and sexuality diverse young people. And I'm a facilitator for one of those groups, Transform, which is a peer support group for gender diverse and gender questioning young people.
Awesome. Cool. And I am Angelo Lebeau. I am the development coordinator at Rape Crisis Dunedin. I'm also one of the coordinators for the National Collective of Rape Crisis. And I am a crisis support worker, and I'm also an educator working in primary prevention. A lot of the work that I've done with our organisations has kind of been around inclusive practice within the sexual violence sector, especially with the agencies associated with our national collective, and furthering kind of the development of that understanding and that knowledge. Awesome. I guess I should share this little screen here that I have.
So we're just going to start with a bit of an outline of what we'll be talking about today.
So flick through here. So this is who we are.
But before we get into that, who else is here and what do we already know? So if you'd like to share your details in the chat, and then Miriam can share with us who else is in the room. So it might be helpful if you shared with us the kind of training that you've already attended around these kinds of issues. And
or if you haven't received any training as well, that might be helpful to know. Awesome.
And just while we sort of set things up here, I'm just going to sort of set a bit of an online kawa for this. So just be mindful of your communication in the chat. We're talking about some sensitive issues here. If you feel like you have any questions that come up, feel free to post them in the chat box and we'll respond to those questions at the end, but we probably won't respond during the presentation just because we have a lot of content to get through. Hopefully the content will answer your questions before we get to the end though. And as presenters, we're totally comfortable with responding to questions about any of the themes or concepts that we refer to in this webinar. And we may sometimes reference our own experience as practitioners. We're not here to discuss our own lived experiences as members of the rainbow community.
Cool. So if you'd like to line this up, Judy?
Yeah, sure. So we're going to start off with just outlining our learning objectives. So we have 3 key learning objectives. We'll have a bit of a check-in.
Well, we just did that.
Yeah. Then we'll go through the underlying concepts and terminology that we might be using in this, just to get things really clear. We'll go through a bit of a theoretical framework with some background information and research, and then we'll get into the really practical stuff. So looking at how to deliver material to youth and connect with clients in a way that's inclusive, and how we can support educators and crisis workers who are part of the rainbow community. Then we'll look at some further resources, and then we will open things up to a new initiative that we're looking at for some sexual violence sector networking for rainbow community people. And then we'll take questions.
Cool. So we have a few learning objectives for today. So we kind of have this overall goal that we're wanting, which is to really improve the knowledge and awareness and practices of LGBTQIA, inclusive sexual violence prevention and support. So we're talking about both prevention and support. There's obviously a lot more we could talk about more specifically with each of those, but this is a good starting point. So what we're hoping for at the end of this webinar, you'll have some understanding of how to discuss the role that sex, sexuality, and gender diversity plays in the dynamics of sexual violence, to demonstrate what LGBTQIA inclusive communication and engagement looks like in practice. So we will be talking about how you engage with clients and how you are in classrooms if you're talking to students or delivering prevention material, and outlining specific ways that your organizations could support the workers or the educators within your organizations that are part of that community, because that's a really important part as well of this work. So to start off as well, we thought that we'll just add this little slide in, because this is a really good way to frame this kind of training or this kind of knowledge as an ongoing process. So this little quote here from a piece of research that came out around cultural humility as opposed to cultural competence. So in this critically important dialogue of defining training outcomes, it's proposed that the notion of cultural humility be distinguished from that of cultural competence. It incorporates a lifelong commitment to self-evaluation and critique, and to developing mutual beneficial and non-paternalistic partnerships with communities on behalf of individuals and defined populations. And so this is really about a willingness to learn from others, and especially communities that are kind of their own experts and know their own experiences. It kind of poses the dynamics of, like, you know, that community being the expert rather than I've learned all of this stuff and now I'm culturally competent and I'm the expert. Because the rainbow community have really unique psychosocial needs and are their own experts of their knowledge. And cultural humility is actually embodied within cultural competency anyway, but it extends it so that it increases, you know, people's self-critique and improves their learning and their outcomes. And that's kind of what we're hoping for with this, is kind of an openness and a willingness to learn and an ongoing education kind of process. So we'll move on to.
We're just going to break down some of the underlying concepts we'll be discussing today. So when I'm discussing things, or when we're referencing gender identity, we're really talking about a person's own sense of identification as a woman, a man, neither, both, or somewhere in between. And it can be helpful to think of gender as a continuum or a spectrum, where culture, feelings, thoughts, family, society around us can influence what we think either end or any point on that spectrum might feel like for an individual. Separate from gender identity is our gender expression. So that's how we represent gender to other people, or how other people interpret our gender through voice, clothing, body shape, hairstyle, pronouns, and many other things. So again, culture, feelings, thoughts, family around us can influence what that might look like to some people. And due to changes in social attitudes and general changes in the perception of gender over time, a trait that might be considered masculine in one generation might be a feminine norm in the next. Then, distinct from gender is the idea of sex, specifically biological, physiological sex. So this is a system for assignment and classification of people as male or female or intersex, and I'll break that down a little bit soon as well. So this is usually determined by a variety of internal and external physical characteristics, including hormones, chromosomes, and genitalia. Usually the sex someone is assigned at birth is judged by the appearance of their external genitalia, and current understandings of biological sex recognise that this characteristic is also kind of a continuum similar to gender. And then the fourth category that we'll be referencing is that of attraction or sexual orientation. So this is a person's individual sense of physical, romantic, emotional, or spiritual attraction to others. It can change over time, and just as sex and gender are distinct concepts, attraction is discrete from our sense of gender identity, biological sex, or gender expression. So transgender people, for example, may be straight, bisexual, lesbian, gay, or asexual. So just breaking down some of the lesser known terminology that we might be referencing. When we're talking about the rainbow community or LGBTQIA+, we're going to be using those sort of interchangeably. Rainbow community is just an inclusive way of trying to reference a whole array of different identities without being exclusive. And then LGBTQIA, that's lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, asexual, and anything else that feels like it fits with that group as well. Another way of looking at that community is talking about diverse sexual orientation, gender identity, and sex characteristics. So this is language that's been used by the Human Rights Commission and various other international bodies, including the UN. This is a distinction some people are kind of unclear on. So transgender is a broad term for people whose identity, expression, behaviour, or general sense of self doesn't conform to that, which is usually associated with the sex they were assigned in the place they were born. So people who identify as transgender may also identify with a whole other range of terms for gender diversity, whereas transsexual is a more specific term generally used by people who use medical interventions such as surgery or hormone replacement therapy as part of their transition. There are also generational distinctions about how these terms are used, and we recognise that some people may prefer one term over the other or use those terms differently as well. And then cisgender, so trans means to cross over, cis means on the same side of. So cisgender is a term used to describe a gender identity that matches an individual's assigned sex at birth. For example, a person who's assigned male at birth and grows up to identify as a man. So this is an important word because it avoids the idea of normal versus transgender. Transgender, cisgender. And then agender is basically someone who's hit unsubscribe on the whole system of gender entirely. So agender is basically without gender, somebody who just doesn't really subscribe to any kind of construction of gender that we have available to us at the moment. And then asexual, without sexuality. So asexual people may not experience sexual attraction at all. They may engage in fully satisfying non-sexual romantic relationships or intense friendships, or they may not be interested in romantic relationships at all. And there are varying degrees of asexuality, including people who identify with terms like demisexual or grey asexual. And now when I'm talking about intersex people or people with intersex conditions, we're referencing people whose reproductive or sexual anatomy doesn't fit the typical definitions of either male or female. So they fall somewhere on the continuum between biologically male or female due to variations in chromosomes, hormones, or reproductive organs and genitalia.
It's important as well when we're talking about these kind of terms. There are culturally specific terms that are also used. So what Judy kind of broke down was Pakeha, kind of lesser known Pakeha identity terms. Those aren't the same terms that other people may use. So, for example, if somebody is Māori, they may choose to use a different set of terms, which is very closely linked with their Māori identity. So, ira tangata, gender diverse, takatapui. So there has been a lot more kind of work to kind of pull this out of the historical records. Colonization just destroyed a lot of the research around this, but this kind of has been brought back, takatapui, as a term to encompass people who, have part of the rainbow community and a Māori. The traditional meaning is intimate companion of the same sex. So they may use these terms instead of, the Pakeha terms of lesbian, gay, bisexual. They might identify as takatapui instead. And there are some other terms as well, more specific terms. So tangata iratane, someone assigned female at birth and who has, there's a little spelling mistake, who has a male gender identity. And same with whakawahine, terms describing someone assigned male at birth who has a female gender identity. And similarly, there are lots of Pacifica terminology as well. And I won't go through all of them just because there are actually quite a lot of different culturally specific terms, but these are some examples. So Polynesian cultures, there's a range of different terms that those communities might use instead of the Pakeha terms that we have, and is probably more recognizable, I guess, to a lot of people. But it is important when we're talking about this, and we will provide resources at the end as well, so we don't think too hard about learning all of these terms and like locking them all in just for the time being, because there is something else to keep in mind when we're talking about terms and we're doing this kind of training around the awareness and like what those terms mean and how you treat people because of those terms. There is this really good resource. So Forge, they are an international organization working specifically around like trans and gender diversity and sexual violence kind of area. So using a client or a student's terms tells them that you're listening closely and respect their right to define. So the terms paradox is going to incorporate kind of two things that are simultaneously true. The first one is that terms are really crucial, that we need to know what these kind of terms are and have an understanding that they exist and what they mean and what they might mean to people and what they might mean to you is how you work with them. So terms are really crucial. At the same time, because of what we've just kind of gone over, there is no consensus on identity terms. They might mean different things to different people. People use terms interchangeably. And if you use just the definition of those terms that kind of people know and understand in a really limited way, that might limit the reality of that individual's unique experience. So at the same time as they're really crucial, they're kind of meaningless. They don't tell you everything that you would need to know about somebody to be able to work with them. What you really need to know about people in order to serve them appropriately isn't actually going to come from their identity term necessarily, but from asking really specific questions about their needs and their concerns and their experiences, because the experiences within the rainbow community are hugely varied. Yeah, so this can be applied also to identity labels, but also experiences, personal histories, body part names, pronouns, and nearly any component of who a person is. So we're not going to keep making assumptions based on just the terms that we have or what we know about those terms. It is still a really person-centered approach that you have to take. But it is important to develop a meaning of kind of what is going on with the terminology. And on another note...
So while a lot of language can be quite fluid, sometimes language can be quite fixed as well, specifically when we're talking about legal language and legal language regarding sexual crimes. So looking at how the act of rape is defined in Section 128 within the idea of sexual violation, it's important to note the role that language plays in dictating who can commit rape and who can be a victim to rape. This is still based on specific kinds of anatomy. And the implications of this, that it's just an important consideration when referring people on to the police and the experiences they may have with them. And we can have more inclusive definitions of sexual assault and rape, and support services should be explicitly inclusive when defining these as well, including who it can happen to and who can perpetrate it. And we can continue putting pressure on legislative change to have some of these updates included in another review of the Crimes Act as well.
Mm-hmm. And we just popped at the bottom there because it is quite a good reading. There's a good book on, it's called Representing Trans. There's a chapter in that which had just popped at the bottom there, the significance of naming harm for trans women. One of the things that we do know is that trans people, and in particular trans women, do experience disproportionate rates of violence. And so this particular little piece here is about how the legal language around that kind of is pushing that kind of idea of the idea of how language is actually making it really, really difficult for people to get convictions or to understand their own experiences as well, because this is the way that we're kind of constructing this dynamic. Cool. So why are we having this conversation? Other than we really need to. There is a general agreement across sectors, and this is across a lot of sectors. I do some professional development with people in different sectors, and from what I hear, a lot of people don't have any training around this. So across sectors, rainbow issues are not sufficiently covered in training programs and educational settings. That might include social workers, counsellors, health professionals, helping professionals. There's very little exposure that people have to trans and gender diversity issues in induction processes or in subsequent professional developments as well. That means equal access to resources continues to be an issue for people who do not fit the gender binary because the services aren't actually equipped to be able to work with people safely. Many services and facilities continue to be sex segregated as well, so public bathrooms, schools, emergency or homeless shelters, prisons, athletics facilities, dormitories, and actually that includes places like rape crisis centres or sexual violence agencies. What does it mean for people who don't fit within the gender binary to be able to access sexual violence services and support? This is the same thing here. So the problem of access to facilities often based on biological sex. And another thing that we do find as well is that quite often when people are accessing services, the shift in focus from their presenting issue moves from what they're presented with to their gender or their sexual identity, which can be a really stressful experience for them because, you know, people should be able to come and get what they need from the services for that particular issue that they're coming with and not be pathologized for their identities or, you know, their choices or just who they are, really.
We sort of know this as the trans broken arm syndrome.
Yes.
So you show up with a broken arm and you get asked about your gender identity and that has...
Yeah. So what we do know, there's quite a lot, and I'm not going to go through the whole thing just because there's quite a lot of research, and we'll pop that right at the back. There are a lot of references that we have, but I'm not going to go through all of it. There's quite a lot of research that does show kind of the prevalence rates are huge for the rainbow community. And essentially what all of this research tells us is that the rainbow community experiences disproportionate rates of violence, and that includes physical and sexual violence, depressive symptoms and suicidality, but they're also less likely to report harm. So that's telling us also that people experiencing things, but they also don't feel comfortable to talk about things, and that's a major barrier for people. Another thing to keep in mind as well is that not only are people experiencing huge rates of violence, but there are particular dynamics that happen within rainbow relationships as well. This is kind of a little resource, and this is from the Outing Violence resource, that the report that came out a couple of years ago that Sandra Dixon was working on. This is kind of like a little power and control wheel specifically for the rainbow community, for the types of abuse, manipulation, control that can happen specifically within rainbow relationships or happen specifically to people within the rainbow community. I'm not going to go through that whole thing, but that will also be a resource that we can make available as well. And when we're just talking about barriers before, there are a range of barriers. So this is kind of the point at which we're talking about why maybe people within the rainbow community aren't actually feeling comfortable to come forward, because there are so many barriers that come up, and even when they do, sometimes there's just nothing else that, you know, can really be done. People can't work safely with them, or they just don't feel comfortable at all to talk to anyone. So there are a range of barriers here. This workshop will also be available after, so there'll be notes as well with that.
So this is a pretty heavy information session, so just take a moment to breathe. And now that we know what the problem is and why that problem looks like that, what can we do in practice to be more inclusive and more engaging with people from this community? So we're going to start just by looking at how we can deliver sexual violence prevention material to youth in a way that's inclusive. So the first practical thing that I would encourage is when you're introducing yourself as a facilitator, introduce yourself with your name and your pronouns as well. So this is a practice that a lot of young people are quite experienced with, but the practice of sharing your pronouns normalizes that for people who may need to share their pronouns, whose pronouns may not be as evident. And we should not assume that anyone's pronouns are evident. So assuming someone's gender is just a practice we should be moving away from. And to normalize that, we can introduce ourselves. So, hi everybody, I'm Judy O'Brien and my pronouns are she and her. The next point I'd make is that when you are delivering material, always assume that someone from this community or someone with one of these identities is in the room with you. So avoid using othering language like those people, people like that, people with these whatever. There's probably a young person in the room who identifies with those characteristics or identities, and they don't want to be made to feel less than or not part of the class. The next point is that you can always make space for your students to teach you. So young people are rapidly developing new ideas and becoming far more familiar with new concepts of gender identity and sexuality than a lot of older people are. So we don't have to be the experts. We can admit the limitations of our knowledge and make space for the people who are in that room with us to share knowledge with us, but don't rely on them to be the ones to educate you. So also, it's important to acknowledge the role of gender analysis in sexual violence prevention work. So acknowledging prevalence rates at the same time as acknowledging that anyone of any gender can either perpetrate or experience sexual harm in some kind of way. So not everyone's experience is going to be the same. And following on from that, when we are discussing general concepts around the experience of sexual violence, using gender-neutral pronouns and language is really important as well. And again, it's also important to acknowledge culturally specific understandings of gender and sexuality issues so that we are inclusive of anyone who might be in the room with us, and we're sharing the information about other people's lived experiences as well. And when you're preparing example scenarios or using example scenarios in prevention work, it's really important to include explicit reference to same-sex relationships and non-binary identities, but avoid being tokenistic. So use multiple examples of these diverse relationships and identities and equally privilege those same-sex and gender diverse scenarios. And ensure that some of those scenarios have positive and healthy relationship outcomes as well, so that you're not just using negative examples of those experiences as well.
There's a long history of negative examples, so we need to see some positive and healthy ones as well. So Judy's going to kind of move on to how we connect with clients in a way that's inclusive.
Yeah, so again, don't rely on your clients to teach you. Educate yourself first. Your clients are already in a traumatic space probably, and they want to be able to rely on you. And they don't want to have to explain all of these aspects of their identity when the core issue on top is something completely unrelated to that. It might be related, but it'd be nice if they didn't have to do the teaching in that moment.
And just like another little add-in for that, it is quite obvious when people feel like they're trying to teach their help, like whoever's supporting them. It is quite a widely known thing that people feel like they're constantly teaching people, and that can be really, really stressful for people, especially when they're trying to get support, but also especially if they're in crisis. It's not really a time that you feel like doing that.
Yeah, we'll reference minority stress a bit later as well. So the next step you can take is by taking a person-centered approach and a healing-centered approach. So this means avoiding assumptions and asking questions without value judgments, keeping in mind the concept of the terms paradox here as well. It's also important for you to stay informed of sexual abuse healthcare manifestations, so STDs, HIV, pregnancy, related injuries, spontaneous termination, sexual assault injuries, depression, anxiety. Practitioners need to know how to work with clients safely to support them around any of these potential issues, especially with working with gender diverse people as well and how that might affect them. And be aware of processes, relevant services or authorities that may require a client to disclose personal information relevant to their gender, their body, or their legal information. So anything that's going to require them to disclose personal details that might be difficult for them and might change their experience of that as well.
We're just going to talk about like a quite specific example of this. Maybe, say, if somebody needed to have a forensic examination and they were a gender diverse person, what does that mean in terms of when they go there? Do they have the advocates for them? What if they're misgendered? What if that process is incredibly stressful because they're experiencing dysphoria? What if that process involves them having to address the fact that they may have a different legal gender marker? All of these kinds of things are things that you should be thinking about if you're supporting somebody. And that's kind of what we're talking about when we talk about this. All right. So another element of this is not just the work that we do to support people or go into classrooms and talk to students or engage with organizations or businesses. It's also really important that we're supporting the people within our workforce. So this is kind of some initial starting points for how you're supporting the people within the sector. That might be educators, that might be crisis workers who are part of that community. So the first little point that we have here is engage in consultation with Rainbow organizations. So these are organizations such as Rainbow Youth, Inside Out, local organizations, local LGBTQI support groups to the whatever area you're working in. Engage with those organizations because they're really kind of working in that space. You need to kind of wrap that service around and make sure that the people within your organization also is working with the people in their community so that they know what the issues are specific to that community in that area as well. Facilitating for all staff to receive comprehensive gender and sexual diversity training as part of your induction process. So as part of your onboarding, as part of your hiring, running that through as part of the training that people have to take when they come into your organization or your agency. If this already exists in your organization, maybe have a look and check how up to date it is as well. Because I know that there are some kind of outdated programs out there. We've done a lot of work at Rape Crisis to update ours. And that's kind of an ongoing process. Assessing your physical environments. Are they explicitly inclusive spaces? So do you have resources around for people? Do you have gender neutral bathrooms? Things that are in your physical environment. People should have the appropriate resources available to them. Assessing your policies and procedures. Do they include considerations? So both in terms of client safety and staff and volunteer safety. And I'm saying that, I guess, as a practitioner who's also part of the Rainbow community, there are specific policies and procedures that we have to have in place. Say, if I was going to support somebody and they were part of the Rainbow community, is there something in place to keep me safe, but also to keep them safe? Because if we bump into each other, this is a small community. What happens to keep you both safe so that when you leave that space, it's not going to be really uncomfortable, potentially unsafe outside of that space for those people. And that's both for the client and your staff. It's not expecting only the Rainbow support workers to work with Rainbow clients. I know it can feel like, oh, you know this material really well. You're the best fit for this client, which is maybe a fair assumption to make. But also, if we keep putting that, and we will talk about minority stress later, if you keep putting all of that work onto your Rainbow workers, then that's a lot of stress to kind of take on as well, and a lot of pressure to work with that community.
Conversely, for that point as well, sometimes you may have a client who requests somebody from a community that they identify with, and that's just another conversation you can have with the worker.
Similarly, so not relying solely on the Rainbow identifying or trans and gender diverse employees to be the ones responsible for educating the organisation on gender diversity. So this is really about getting everybody on board. Like anything to do with sexual violence prevention, this is about collective action and actually working together to support each other. So it shouldn't actually be on like everything on your Rainbow employees or volunteers for this particular area of work. Everybody kind of needs to be doing this work as well. As Judy's talked about, expecting educators or crisis workers to share no more personal details about themselves other than their names and pronouns. So not expecting them to necessarily share their experience as a trans or gender diverse or queer person, just for the sake of making sure that person feels safe, because it's about making your workers feel safe as well. But and also another point is providing opportunities for the workers to have support from others around the challenges they have that may be specific to them. So there are specific challenges you may have as a person within the Rainbow community working within this space, both in terms of support work, but also prevention work. You might have people who are part of the Rainbow community going out. you have to answer a lot of questions. Maybe a lot of those questions might be around that person's gender or their sexuality. So how we kind of decide what's the best way to handle that, it'd be really helpful if, people in that community could talk to each other about what the best way is to kind of deal with that really specific challenge that might come up.
We'll be talking a little bit more about a working initiative.
So I guess this is kind of most of what we've kind of gone through. I know there's not there's obviously a lot more that we could discuss about this, but we'll just do a quick summary, and we will have questions, a question and answer kind of period as well.
So overall, we have a few sort of inclusive guidelines for the whole sector, from prevention to crisis support. So just being aware of sort of creating an environment that's welcoming, putting posters out, having just some kind of signifier that shows that your space is inclusive, and encouraging the schools that you work in to do the same. Having inclusive data collection processes, so understanding that there are multiple boxes that people might want to tick when they're sharing their personal details. So this is part of evaluation processes, induction processes, any forms that you might need to get people to fill out.
Just another side note on that, at the moment we don't really have adequate data to be able to articulate what the issues are specifically in Aotearoa, so this is a really important thing that I think that people need to pick up.
And again, we discussed policy, so ensure that your policies extend protection to people outside of the gender binary. And understand that people's experiences are their own unique experiences, and they may relate to their bodies in various ways that it pays to just be comfortable listening to and understanding. It's also really important to be aware of services that are potentially unsafe for people in the community to engage with before including them in referral pathways. So there are services that may have good or bad processes, or staff that are not trained in this area. It's just important to have awareness around who those services are, and that's a discussion that already exists within the LGBTQIA community. This information is kind of shared to keep people safe when accessing support, and some people within the community already have a strong awareness of what these good and bad services are. It's just important to listen to your clients and students if they feedback this kind of information to you, investigate it, and keep it in mind for the future. And never underestimate the importance of your allyship and advocacy. So back your students and clients up and understand how important that is. And taking that step to the next level, actively work towards dismantling some of those barriers we've discussed. This may include understanding inadequate support at services, or a lack of trust in police and healthcare systems, legal language, a lack of explicit inclusion in resources, representation, and even anti-trans and gender critical sentiments that might come from some places. So this might also include developing an understanding of gender dysphoria and the various pathways people may or may not choose to affirm their gender. So be aware that there can also be a fear of disclosing abuse or serious mental health concerns due to gatekeeping in the health system, and the implications that some of those disclosures may have for people accessing gender affirming care and intervention like surgery and hormone therapy. And the final point I'd make here is just consider potential scenarios that might come up before you engage in any of these situations. So what are some scenarios that might come up that might require gender inclusive language and engagement? So just think about that before you actually walk into a classroom or engage with a client.
Cool. So we're at the summary. I know this is quite a lot of information, but kind of the bottom line, we'll just pop the overall kind of what we're seeing and what we hope for. So there are a wide variety of experiences within the rainbow community that extends to language preference that people might have for their identities. Their identity, there's a wide variety of how people are, that their identities are really different, cultural backgrounds as well, preferred treatment. All of these things can range hugely. Even so, one person who might be trans, that's not to say that all of their preferred treatment or their backgrounds is going to be the same as another person who's trans. There's a lot of different kind of different modifications that can be made for people's experiences. There is a strong rationale for integrating comprehensive gender and sexual diversity knowledge in any sexual violence work. That's across the crisis support, ongoing support, recovery, and prevention. And all staff who are working in the sexual violence space should actually have access to appropriate training around that. Specific policies and procedures are actually necessary to keep both the clients engaging in the services as well as the staff and volunteers who are part of the Rainbow community safe. This is a small community, really. So we need to make sure that we're keeping everybody in that space safe because, they might see each other out on the street. It's not a huge community, but everybody deserves to have equal access to resources. So how are we going to keep that safe for everybody? Directors and managers of services and authorities, plus anyone who is in a position to influence policy and practice in institutional settings, or any organisational settings, needs to be crucial participants in initiatives concerning trans and gender diversity issues. And that's not just the people who are maybe affected by that. That's anybody who's in any service, who is in any position to be able to make any kind of influence. That's a lot of privilege for people to have, so people should use their privilege to make some change. Cool. So we've got some further resources, just a wee list here. There's some about down to where it says TOAH NNEST. The last three are kind of more international resources. I think it's relevant to just point out at this stage, there aren't that many resources around specifically sexual violence and the Rainbow community. There are a couple, which we'll link to. But most of the resources that we have are around gender or they're not specific to this particular intersection, and this is a real issue and a real barrier. So we kind of need to move beyond that, and this is why we're hoping we're having this space right now.
And even some of the resources that have been produced in New Zealand are kind of limited in their scope. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done here.
Absolutely. And then one other little concept I guess I'll discuss is the minority stress model, and I'll just mention that because this is kind of a good little model, and it's been adapted a number of times for different research. For the processes and I guess the outcomes, the dynamics of minority stress, and this is good rationale for anybody who's considering why we need to make these kinds of changes for the clients and the students, and everybody really, but also for your staff, so that stress, all of these things are happening already within the community. So you don't want to further that stress by being saying, oh, well, there are all these things, all these issues that are particular to you. You're already experiencing them, but I'm going to put all that responsibility onto you even more to fix all of the stuff. That this model already exists. This is already happening. So we need to take a kind of a step back and have a wider approach to supporting our colleagues and to supporting the people that we are working with directly. I'll just leave that there, but that's quite a good little way to understand how the dynamics of stigma and prejudice and discrimination are already operating at an individual level and at a societal level. Awesome.
So this is a new initiative that we've been working with TOAH NNEST to establish. So this is a Rainbow Violence Prevention Network practice group. And this is to support gender, sexuality and sex characteristic diverse people who are currently practicing in all areas of the sexual violence sector to create a safe space to have practical discussions about some of the really day-to-day issues that we might face in our roles. As Angelo talked about, a lot of questions come through for facilitators who are gender diverse about their gender, if their gender expression doesn't fit what the students are expecting. There are various other issues that come up for people working in crisis support and their own experiences of working in the sector. So this is a space for us to just have discussions about what we're facing and sharing strategies for empowering ourselves through that.
Awesome. So before I guess we the only things that we kind of really have left are some references, but this is probably a good time for us to stop and see if Miriam's around.
Maybe we can start taking some questions.
Yeah.
Kia ora to you both. What an amazing presentation. I just thought I'd share some shout outs from the group together, because I mean the breadth and depth of your presentation was pretty impressive and amazing, and I knew lots of it beforehand because obviously I saw the presentation before it got to this point, and just really impressed with the very concrete practice levels that you gave in terms of the diversity and range, both from a prevention perspective as well as a crisis perspective. And so the one question that I do have as I kind of pop on here some bits and pieces that people have said is, do you have any good resources or scenarios that can be used in an education program for high school?
Yeah, I mean, you can just think of any scenario that you do use and just throw in gender neutral names and gender neutral pronouns, so that it's just a normal interaction that you might be referencing, and just switch up who the people involved in that situation are.
I think a good thing to keep in mind, because that's a really good that's exactly what I would say as well. The people that are looking to hear gender neutral pronouns and kind of gender neutral situations and same-sex relationships, the people that that's really important to will pick up on that stuff, even if you think it's not a big deal. It will actually be a big deal for the people who, that's really relevant to.
And when you're using gender neutral names, people can project whatever gender they might be expecting from that scenario into the scenario for themselves.
Right. The other reflection someone had was just thanks for putting the terminology into the combo, as it can be really hard to navigate sensitively. And I think, there was a great work of, talking about that terms paradox is a really useful reflection point of how there are these terms and they do mean things, but they also don't, and how to stay person-centered and healing-centered at all times is a really important piece that I think came out really strongly from your presentation. In general, people were saying thanks and great. So the other part I really enjoyed was almost the paradox of the pedagogical value of staying class-centered and allowing our groups, our communities to educate us in many ways, because as specialists in any kind of prevention work, our communities are always our experts. But then the flip side is we also need to be really educated. I thought that came across really well in terms of, we can't expect people to educate us constantly, but we need to be humble and be always in a position to be in that space together. So that was really great. People are just posting through, I've really enjoyed this seminar and thank you very much. For those who are currently still online, if you do want to get more updates and more information about this, I'm going to put in a feedback form into the chat. And if you don't usually get our emails, there's also an opportunity to sign up to be able to receive emails about future webinars and future information around TOAH NNEST, Tauiwi caucus, online development and training opportunities. So do fill that out for us. If you don't have access to the chat, you can contact us via Facebook, Twitter, and also our website has all of our contact details on there. Well, if there are any other questions, please do message them through either on Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube, and we'll answer them because we've got a couple more minutes before we're good to go. Was there anything else in terms that you both would like to add? Because you managed to get through a lot in throughout this session, but any kind of personal reflections or kind of nuances that you'd like to explore with the group?
I guess the last couple of things, the only things that I was going to share really was I'm not going to go into the whole reference list, but we were going to mention that the research that does exist at the moment, there's kind of two major reports that have come out. So the outing violence report that came out a couple of years ago, and also the Thursdays in Black, in our own words. Those are two reports. I might just pop them up on the screen actually. if you don't mind, just so I do have them here. So these two here. They're the only two like significant, really like reports that we have in Aotearoa on, I guess, what people are experiencing within the rainbow community when it comes to sexual violence. So keep note of those. But we still need we've still got a lot of work to do around this area as well.
So someone else in the chat also has just reflected that they're noticing how much of the guidelines that you've given also reflect their own bicultural journey in terms of, the similarities around that. Any thoughts and reflections from both of you?
It's important to keep intersectionality in mind, and that there are going to be practices that work for one community that can also work for different aspects of another community. And when we can sort of find synergy in that approach, that's great. But yeah, it's also important to keep in mind the diversity of experiences within those individual communities as well.
I have a little thing to say. One of the things that I pulled up right at the start, the cultural humility versus cultural competency. Even though I'm part of the rainbow community, I still, I'm not the only person in the rainbow community, so my experience is not the same as everybody else's within that community. So I still have to have that level of cultural humility and ongoing learning, even though I'm part of that community. So it's not unreasonable for everybody to feel that like all the time as well, because there's a lot to learn, and being open to that and that ongoing learning is still really important for everybody.
Yeah, a really specific example of that is the use of the term guys when you're talking to a whole group of people. I facilitate a group of gender diverse people, and one of my co-facilitators last night kept referring to the group as you guys, and I'm comfortable with that generally as like a group reference term, but there were a lot of young people in the group who really weren't comfortable with that, and they pointed that out, and that was a space for us as facilitators to step back and learn and recognize and listen. And we're part of the same community that our group is part of as well.
Right, so just a few more comments coming through of just fantastic, thank you, really helpful conversation for me and my practice. And great work, Judy and Angelo. Thanks so much for sharing your learning. So,
awesome.
Both of you. So if there are any more questions, we do have a couple more minutes. If there's last burning ones, otherwise we will share all the resources, the resource list that you have collated. There is another question. Let me see. May we consider information the base of prevention? I think it's important to talk about these issues all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
So I noticed there are, in terms of, you asked before where people are calling in from today, we have Christchurch, Wellington, Nelson, Motueka, Auckland and Italy. So we've got quite a range today. So I think, that consideration of also this type of intersectional practice, in particular how diverse it will be in different parts of the world in regards to that. Any other reflections from you both around that piece?
I guess that is really relevant, I guess, when we're talking about cultural, like having a really strong understanding of how this shifts, these kind of understandings. This is quite a Western, the understandings that we have around gender and sexuality, quite Western, especially in Aotearoa. So when we're talking about these culturally specific terms, of course, those are going to change, and being open to that and not moving into another space and just taking all of this and being like, this is all exactly the same in a different place, because it's actually not. And when we're looking at that minority stress model as well, how that plays a role actually when you're talking about people within the LGBTQI community already experience minority stress. If you add to that, somebody with a different ethnic background than, somebody who was white person within the LGBTQI community from New Zealand, there's extra additional kind of stress. And so that's another thing that you have to think about. I absolutely agree that's, not, you can't just apply this to every single person who's part of this community. But I hope that was coming across in this presentation, is that we're trying not to do that. We're trying not to say this is the experience and this is all the stuff that you have to learn. It's actually encouraging a a really intersectional approach to understanding gender and sexuality as well. It just so happens that a lot of the information that we have, there's not a lot of information that's from Aotearoa. A lot of the research is really concentrated in specific places, and I think that says more about academia and who's kind of able to produce that research. But I think that is really important to take into consideration. There's a lot of community research that comes out in different places as well. Some of that is not highly accessible. Some of that is just knowledge within the community. And that's why then the Ravo community, there's a lot of information that gets passed around those communities. So we're trying to that's why it's really important to have people within your organizations or within your workforce that are part of that community, because sometimes you don't know stuff unless you have people that are a part of that conversation.
Yeah, I think it's important to keep in mind being critical of information as well, and recognizing how quickly information can change. Information can be really fluid in some of these spaces, so just trying to keep up to date and usually talking to somebody from that community is the best way to stay informed.
And I definitely feel from working in sexual violence for a number of years now, in particular with LGBTQI+ rights and the intersection with sexual violence, there is that absolute need to stay abreast with the changes of the community and how they evolve, and even the reflection we had before around terminology and how the language changes constantly. So it's one of those, definitely that shift from cultural competencies. We can't get a tick box of we have done this once and that is it. It is an ongoing relationship and partnership with another community that has also high needs. So, and how do we work together and collaborate, and what will look different in different spaces around prevention and sexual violence intervention. Overall, there was just another comment around, we agree the mention of broken arm syndrome and really refocusing on the issue and not the sexuality. Oh, you've broken your arm, it must be because you're LGBTQI. And then just people saying that they've loved this presentation. So just for everyone who's online, this presentation will get tidied up and re-put on YouTube, so it will be available. So before you share this link around, give us a day to be able to sort it out, and then we'll put it officially on YouTube, and we'll allow you to spam it broad and wide. And do get hold of us if you want us to be able to contact you directly. So are there any last words from either of you before I thank you officially and close?
I'd just like to thank everyone for engaging with this, and just show my appreciation for people considering as many issues as they can while they work in this sector.
Well, exactly the same. Yeah. Thank you for being here. Thank you if you're still here.
Thank you to you both. This has been an incredible presentation and I've taken away a lot from it. And I was thinking about one of my first trainings here in New Zealand around LGBTQI+, and it was very much separated, and it's not often that we get to see an integrated presentation of LGBTQI issues as well as sexual violence. And we don't often get to see that. So I feel very privileged and lucky to have been able to host you. You've done a fabulous job, and thank you so much. So we're going to end today's session. Thank you everyone who's joined us from far and wide, and go well.